Hi guys, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. We're going to be doing some more ancient Greek and Roman history, more specifically Alcibiades and Coriolanus. These are two of my favorite individuals, and you'll probably see why as we get into it. So starting with Alcibiades, he comes from, particularly on his mother's side, quite a powerful birth line, supposedly related to Ajax, from pretty important figure in the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And his father was one of the major financiers of the navy, so he was also pretty prominent as well. After his mother died, he was put under the guardianship of Pericles, who was also very famous, and we talked about it in a previous episode. And this important upbringing granted him the privilege of being a student of Socrates, who was one of the he was the leading intellectual at the time, who was ultimately put on trial and killed. At the time, or just throughout his life, Alcibiades was extremely vain. He pretty much was extremely indulgent. He had many lovers throughout his life, and Socrates thought that he could change him. It was kind of like a challenge for him. But at the end of Socrates' life, Alcibiades was used as evidence that Socrates' teaching did not work because Alcibiades was so vain and so self-centered, so egotistical. But regardless, he somehow managed to win the affection of everyone who seemed to come across his path. This is probably largely due to his beauty. He was considered the most beautiful person in Athens at the time, and perhaps ever in the history of Greece. It was stated by Antisthenes that if Achilles did not like this, he was not really handsome, and that's just indicative of how really beautiful this guy was. But yeah, regardless, he pretty much gets his start at the later half of the Peloponnesian War. There was a peace treaty, a 30-year peace treaty, organized by Nicias, who was one of his later rivals, and he kind of wanted to push this peace treaty aside because he was not included in it. Some say he was not included because he was too young, or for other reasons, but regardless, he pushed to end the peace treaty. He ended up having like a string of victories. He proved to be eventually he did get the peace treaty pushed aside, and the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between Sparta and Athens, continued. And he proved to be a very powerful general and commander, and managed to align a string of victories for himself and for the Athenians. He was starting to come out of famous, obviously, because he was so cocky and so vain, but also supposedly he was having a lot of affairs while away. His wife tried to divorce him for having an affair with some escorts, but he picked her up and pulled her out of court, so the divorce never happened. But regardless, he starts creating a lot of enemies in Athens who want to ostracize him. One of them was Hyperbolus, who tried to ostracize both him and Nisus, but they teamed up and got Hyperbolus ostracized. So if you didn't see the last episode, ostracism wasn't just merely to ostracize someone. Ostracism was a form of extreme democracy where every citizen would vote on someone to be removed from or a leader to be removed from the state, and whoever got pulled out in the ballot process would be removed. So eventually there's a sort of a war in Sicily, and the Segestra come to Athens to ask for help in fighting with Silenus. Nisus, who is always Alcibiades' rival, opposes this, but Alcibiades is extremely ambitious and tells the Athenians that this could be an opportunity to ultimately take over Sicily, and they eventually decide to set sail to Sicily. Nisus helps him out once he's humble in defeat, and helps out Alcibiades and establishes a large ship fleet to go on the excursion and help him out. However, while away, or just prior to leaving, he gets accused of defiling many Hermes statues, which supposedly he didn't do. And it was a big crime back then to defile these statues because they are the gods. Hermes was a god. And he offers to go on trial with the trial for execution, but the trial never happens. They postpone it, and he ends up setting out sail to Sicily to fight the battle. While there, more and more rumors start growing, and his popularity starts to drop, and they ultimately sentence him to death for avoiding his trial, which he was decided not to go to ultimately because he knew he would be killed anyways. So he defects to Sparta, the enemy in the Peloponnesian War, and he promises the Spartans that he would render aid and service greater than all the harm he had done. Ultimately, the Athenians, left without Alcibiades' aid and service, end up losing the sea battle to the Spartans. And he has a lot of great success for the Spartans. They managed to take him in, which is surprising, and this is probably once again indicative of how charismatic he was and what a great orator, and perhaps just merely his beauty. The Spartans learned to support him, and what he does, one of the things he does is he puts a Spartan fort outside of Athens, so all of the Athenians have to stay inside the walls, and it puts a lot of pressure on them. But ultimately, he ends up having a child with the king of Sparta's wife, Aegeus II, and Aegeus plans on killing him. And fortunately for Alcibiades, he figures out about this quickly and runs away once again. And like Themistocles, he runs to Sparta. And in Sparta, the Achaemenid Empire, they take him in. Once again, probably because he is so convincing. He was said to be the prince in talking, but poor in speaking. In sense, he's good at whispering and good at starting rumors and good at convincing, but he had a lisp, so he actually wasn't supposedly not a great orator in speaking to people. But others contrast this by saying he had such great charm that they sort of overlooked his lisp. So what he does for the Persian Empire is he convinces them not to keep financing the Spartans. At the time, the Achaemenids, or the Persians, were allied with Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, and he convinces them not to, or to delay sending troops to Sparta so that the war would be dragged out and they could seize Greece once the two powers, Athens and Sparta, had been slowly defeated themselves. But meanwhile, he didn't actually supposedly care for the Persians. He really just wanted the Athenians to win and to win back the loyalty of his native country. So he starts communicating with Athens again, and he decides that in a democracy, or the regular people would not be sufficient in voting him back. So he tries to help them reestablish the oligarchy. And ultimately, the oligarchy, there is a coup, and the government of 400 oligarchs take over, and Alcibiades starts to come back into favor. He's worried that if he goes back to Athens, they'll turn against him and he'll be put on trial again, and this time actually be killed. So he decides he needs to have a victory on the way back. So on the way back, he starts a naval battle with Sparta, a very close naval battle, and he wins that victory. And he wins a couple other victories on the way to small towns. He's very hesitant to come back. He doesn't trust the Athenians, but ultimately when he sees his family and friends at the shore, he is happy and welcomingly retrieved by the Athenians, or received by the Athenians. Unfortunately, he arrives on the least lucky day, so least lucky day in the Athenian calendar, so he's very worried that something unfortunate might come of him. So ultimately he is granted supreme commander of land and sea, of Athens at the time. But unfortunately, quickly into this, Sparta gets a new leader, Lysander, who is another one of Plutarch's lives and a great commander of Sparta, and they start winning a lot of battles for Athens, and as a result, Alcibiades' fame starts deteriorating. Similarly, there's a new leader of Persia, Cyrus the Younger, Darius the Second son, and he reestablishes the financing of the Spartan army, and Sparta starts becoming a lot more threatening. One of Alcibiades' commanders fails him and poorly initiates a fight with the Spartans. Alcibiades is blamed and once again loses favor of the people, so he exiles himself. On the way, he tries to, once again, he never gives up on Athens, and he tries heading towards the Persians to once again convince them and work his magic, but Lysander sends a group of assassins to his house, and they burn it down. And while the house is burning down, he runs out with a dagger and is shot down with arrows. So that is the death of him, and kind of indicative of his character. He's always fighting, even to the end. He still runs out with a dagger, even though he knows he would lose. I think of him as kind of a perfect example of a Byronic hero after Lord Byron. I've got a little picture of Lord Byron. He's actually my favorite poet, or at least right now he's my favorite poet. That could change soon. But essentially, a Byronic hero is one with like extreme beauty, extreme like arrogance, but also like internally sort of struggled or have a sort of dichotomy in their soul or something like that. But either way, he ends in tragedy, and he is I just think he proves that he is successful across multiple different leaderships. He manages to succeed when he works for the Athenians, succeed when he works for the Spartans, and succeed when he works for the Persians. And it's not just the result of circumstances, or maybe he was just a glorified opportunist, but when you succeed that many times, I think you gotta conclude that perhaps it is something inherent about him that makes him so great. Oh, and he lived from 450 BC to 404 BC. I tend to forget to say those dates. Moving on to Coriolanus. So Coriolanus, there's not too much about his like early life, but he's very famous throughout. I wouldn't call it pop culture, but throughout culture. There's a Shakespearean play about him, his second last tragedy. There's a Beethoven overture called Coriolanus or Coriolanian. And he's very much similar to Alcibiades in being successful on both sides of the battlefield. So I guess we'll start out from the beginning. He was born Gaius Marcius, and he proves a bunch of bravery on the battlefield. They're having a losing battle, and he gallantly charges directly into the enemy with a small group of troops and manages taking over the whole city in a whole Volscian town named Carioli. So the general of the army gives him the third name, Coriolanus, after the town. He becomes very famous amongst Rome, but he quickly starts establishing himself a hatred for the plebeians. He was very frugal himself, and he never strived for too much money, but it is said that he trampled on the poor for merely pride and insolence. So one of the things that he did was, after there was a lot of starvation in Rome at the time, and they had a surplus sent to them from one of their supporting states of grain, but he proposed that they have a reversal of pro-plebeian diffusion of the resources. So that meant he sent the resources back to the rich to reverse the pro-plebeian initiatives that had been implemented back in the time. This gets him since at the time it was a republic, a lot of hatred amongst the Roman people, and he is exiled. Well, he is sentenced on trial, but he never shows up to trial, so he instead flees to the enemy, the Volscians. The Volscians, he promises to help them out. The Volscians are the enemy of the Romans, to uprise again and defeat them with his insider information. And they managed to greatly hurt the Romans and win a lot of battles and ultimately get almost towards taking over Rome itself. So what Rome does is they send a bunch of ambassadors to try to convince him to stop and help out Rome again. And then they send ambassadors twice, and both times he rejects it. And then they eventually send priests, and once again he rejects it. Finally, his wife and daughter and the women of Rome go out onto the battlefield and approach his tent, and finally he settles and rejects what he did, kind of like a tu brute moment for him, where he is humbled by the women, and they set up statues in Rome to commemorate the victory of the women for this. And yeah, here's a picture from a Shakespeare play of Coriolanus being humbled by the women of Rome, and he settles down his arm. And here's another one. Yeah, so ultimately he ends up going back to the Volscians, and the Volscians are very upset because they feel like he's betrayed him, so they set up a trial. But once again, similar to Alcibiades, he's assassinated before the trial and is killed. In 48 Laws of Power, he quotes Alcibiades and says, "Always say less than is necessary." All of this he could have been avoided. If he was not so harsh on the plebeians, he could have still been appreciated by the Romans. And if he had not been so risky as to upset the Volscians, he probably did not have to be killed there. So I guess in terms of comparisons, they were both extremely adaptable leaders, and extremely effective in convincing the opposing side, in supporting them and protecting them from their former states. They were also both extremely militarily successful. Plutarch notes that Alcibiades might be marginally better because he was also great military commander by sea, but both of them were extremely effective. Alcibiades is said to have never failed. The only two times he really failed were that original occasion with Sparta, but that was more of his general's fault, and later in the continuation of the Peloponnesian War against Lysander, where his general once again fails him. But both of them were altogether fantastic military leaders. In terms of differences, they both did not really care for the poor and the plebeians, as they called them in Rome, but Alcibiades was not as outwardly reproachful of them. He was more reproachful of them simply because they did not support him and did not love him, and the oligarchy was a way for him to get power, whereas Coriolanus simply hated the plebeians for no real apparent reason. In terms of their vainness or humbleness, Alcibiades was much more harsh on women. He had a lot of escorts. He cheated on his wife many times. He had intercourse with many slaves and stuff. However, Coriolanus was extremely humbled by the women, and he set down his sword in their honor. Yeah, so these are two of my favorite heroes in Plutarch's lives. I hope you enjoy this video, and I guess one of my favorite books right now is Leaders by General Stanley McChrystal from the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, and he wrote this fantastic book on leadership, and it's similar to Plutarch's Lives, and it compares many different lives across many different fields, and one of the key lessons is that It's not just the leaders' internal traits and skills that make them so great, but often their circumstances, their ability to get people to follow them, or just the people who happen to be around them. But I think for these two individuals, maybe even more so Alcibiades than Coriolanus, they would have been successful anywhere, anytime, and that's what they did. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.